Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Jessie Fields. I'm a medical doctor, and I've worked as a primary care physician in urban communities, in communities of color, for more than 30 years. I grew up in Philadelphia and went to medical school there and started practicing in the inner city community of Philadelphia around my medical school as a medical student and then a resident. And then I spent about 5 years working in Chicago, on the west side of Chicago. I had a medical scholarship that paid for my education and sent me to Chicago. And when I was finished fulfilling that obligation, I moved to New York City, where I have been working for the last 3 decades in the Harlem community. I grew up in a poor African American community and really saw the impact of poverty on my family and friends and neighborhood. And I wanted to become a doctor so that I could help people grow and transform the conditions of their lives, and really particularly for underserved communities to have greater opportunities to move forward. And I became a political activist and have been an independent for decades, and have been involved in building independent politics and the movement of independent voters to transform the two-party system. Something that I've been involved in a lot of community organizing, grassroots organizing in Harlem and other places, and have been advocating for better health care, for better access to quality, comprehensive health care, as well as the kind of social conditions that impact on people's health, from housing to community development, economic opportunities, educational opportunities, opportunities to grow and learn and have human development for our young people and our communities as a whole. And it has always seemed to me that the political process, the two-party system, has really failed communities of color and the American people in general in terms of the social conditions. Right now, we're in the middle of a 2-year crisis with the COVID pandemic. And certainly the impact of COVID has been disproportionate on communities of color, and that's because of ongoing chronic conditions in which people live. So for me, it's been one example of disenfranchisement has been the lack of opportunity for people to have a say and to be able to shape the environments in which they live. And I feel that the two-party system, and in communities of color, that two-party system is represented most directly by Democratic Party control. So it happens to be the case that the Democratic Party takes communities of color and poor communities, including African American communities, for granted. The Democratic Party takes communities of color for granted, and the Republican Party, for the most part, ignores poor communities and communities of color. And that system has not benefited the people of this country. And I think we need really to transform our political process from top to bottom. So I've been working to empower folks at the grassroots, and I have worked with many independent organizations, independent voting in particular, that I'm on the board of, working along with people like Jackie Saylor, who's the president, and Kathy Stewart, who's an organizer, and many others. And of course, the independent movement was very much founded and led by Dr. Lenore Fulani, the first African American and the first woman to be on the ballot for president in all 50 states. And she ran in 1988 and achieved that accomplishment. And we're continuing to build that independent movement. Something that I've been also involved in is Open Primaries, which is a national organization that you probably are all familiar with. That's the president of Open Primaries, John Updike. And Open Primaries is doing some wonderful work, bringing open primaries around the country in different forms. We just had a victory recently in Maine, where actually the state legislature of Maine passed open primaries legislation. And it was really a coming together of Democrats, Republicans, and independents in a very inspiring coalition that was able to bring open primaries to Maine. Another activity that I'm involved in, that I've been working with very closely, is the issue of housing, and many of my patients live in public housing. I work in Harlem, and I've gotten involved in helping them to improve the conditions in which they live. There's a housing crisis in public housing. There's a housing crisis all over the country in terms of people being displaced and issues of gentrification. In New York City, New York City has the largest public housing development uh, in the country. Over 600,000 people in New York City live in public housing, and that's obviously people who are of low income, very, very diverse people, mostly people of color, Black and Latinx, but it's very diverse, including Asian and white residents who live in public housing in New York City. And I've gotten involved in fighting to improve the housing as a doctor, as someone who's concerned about the community. And for me, that very much is an expression of the lack of people having a voice through our political process. There's really no pathway for these communities to be able to change the process, to impact on politics. They're shut out. The political process is very much about insiders. The primaries are closed in New York, and ordinary folks just don't have a voice. So one of the things that I'm very excited about is the growth of independent politics and the opportunities to open up the process for all people. One of the democracy reforms that was passed actually at the end of 2020 in the general election in 2020 was in St. Louis. And I feel very excited about this development. And it's led to some good things for the city of St. Louis in 2021. And that was a reform, an open primaries, nonpartisan elections with approval voting that was passed in St. Louis. And one of the things I find so inspiring about that victory is that it included a majority of people who live in St. Louis. A very diverse coalition was put together that included leading activists from communities of color and activists who had been involved in the Black Lives Matter and the protests against the very, very profoundly unfortunate tragedy of the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, and activists, who've been involved in the communities and trying to empower the communities and speaking out and doing protests, as well as reform activists who came together and they formed this really diverse coalition, and they won their reform for open primaries, nonpartisan elections with approval voting by 68% of the voters of St. Louis, a very important victory. So I am interested in this sort of coming together of social activism and political and structural reform that is transforming our democracy, giving communities a greater voice, and empowering communities through political restructuring. It's clear to independent voters all over the country who are very diverse and are continuing to grow in numbers. It's now the case that about 45% of registered voters in this country, in the United States, are independent voters. And that has been growing for decades. More and more people are seeing the failures of the two-party system and wanting to do something about that, and just really making statements of non-compliance with the political process as it exists, that we really need to transform our process. And my goal is to continue to work to bring people together from all communities to engage in opening up the process, to give a greater voice and greater participation for everyone. I really want to bring together people who've been locked out in so many different ways. And I am very, very proud of the tradition of the African American community in leading the fight for political reform, not only for people of color, but for all people. So the Voting Rights Act that was passed in the 1960s, there were so many demonstrations and rallies and marches that were led by Dr. King, and many, many people of all colors were involved in that. So we're very much continuing that tradition of civil rights and voting rights that was part of the leadership of the African American community in the United States. We consider the right of independent voters to participate in primaries to be one of those fundamental voting rights. That is, no one should have to join a political party in order to have the right to vote. So we're continuing with that effort around the country. And the issues of social activism and restructuring the political process, for me, are inseparable. To bring together everyone in this effort for equal voting rights, for a grassroots democracy and political reform and transforming our political process. Now, in those efforts, when we're trying to do that, to bring together social activism, political restructuring, to move our country forward, we are up against the fierce opposition of the two parties, and in particular, in communities of color, the fierce opposition of the Democratic Party to structural transformation and to opening up the process of elections. So one thing that I'm really looking forward to in 2022 is growing opportunities to move forward in these efforts, in these struggles, in these movements, reimagining and revitalizing our democracy. So there are many exciting things happening. One exciting thing that I'm really looking forward to is the publication of a new book called The Independent Voter by Jackie Salit, who's the president of Independent Voting, and also authoring the book as well is Dr. Omar Ali, who's a university professor, very distinguished historian, and Tom Riley, who's also a professor, an academic with the Arizona State University. And so this is going to be a very wonderful book. It will be coming out in 2022, and I'm really looking forward to that. As well, we are involved in projects to help independent voters be able to speak out in the media. And one of those projects is a spokesperson training program that Independent Voting is doing. Our website, independentvoting.org. I encourage people to go on that website and check out all the wonderful work that we're involved in. And I also work in fields of education with young people. I teach at a medical school and also am very proud to be on the board of a nonprofit, the All Stars Project. And every day, the All Stars Project is bringing really performance opportunities, developmental performance opportunities to young people in poor communities all over the country. And we've continued to do that work through the pandemic, doing that work virtually, a lot on Zoom and WhatsApp and so forth, in those platforms. So it's really an honor and a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with you of the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers. It's a wonderful organization, and I hope you have a great summit. Thank you very much.